She didn't come to Montana to find love. She came to disappear. But the men hunting her don't stop at state lines, and a blizzard doesn't care how desperate you are to survive. Evelyn Mercer stepped off that stagecoach with a stolen ledger sewn into her corset and a dead man's blood still haunting her hands. She thought marrying a stranger in the middle of nowhere would save her life. She had no idea it would change everything she believed about herself. This is her story. Stay until the end, because the woman who arrives in the snow and the woman who walks away from it are two completely different people. Drop your city in the comments. I want to see how far this story travels. Hit like if you're already hooked. The stagecoach hit a rut hard enough to throw Evelyn Mercer sideways into the door, and for one terrible second she thought the whole thing was going over. It didn't. The wheels found purchase again on the frozen road. The horses screamed, and the driver above cursed in a long, breathless string that carried clearly through the roof. Evelyn straightened herself on the bench, pressed her back against the wood, and kept her breathing slow. Deliberate. The way she'd learned to do it, counting the seconds between inhale and exhale until her hands stopped shaking. 4 seconds in, 4 seconds out. Her hands didn't entirely stop shaking, but it was better than nothing. She was the only passenger. Had been since Billings, when the last of them, a heavy-set cattle buyer with red cheeks and the smell of pipe tobacco baked deep into his coat, had climbed out with his bags and wished her luck without quite meeting her eyes. People sense things sometimes without knowing what they were sensing. Something about the way she sat too still, the way she watched the road behind them more than the road ahead. Outside, Montana was doing its worst. December had arrived in the mountains like something with a grudge. The sky was the color of an old pewter spoon, flat, heavy, pressing down on the pine ridges as if the clouds themselves had weight. Snow lay in thick, uneven drifts on either side of the road, crusted over from a freeze 2 nights back, and the pines were bent under it, their branches sagging. Every few minutes, a load of snow would slide off a branch somewhere in the trees and land with a heavy whump that made the horses flinch. Evelyn flinched too, every time. She hated that she flinched. She pressed her fingers flat against her ribs, feeling the faint, stiff outline of the ledger beneath her corset stays. It was still there. Of course it was still there. She checked for it constantly, 12, 15 times a day. The way a person with a loose tooth keeps pressing their tongue against it, even though they know it hurts. The ledger was small, leather-bound, its pages dense with columns of numbers and names written in a careful, cramped hand. She'd read it twice in its entirety during the journey west. She understood maybe a third of what it meant, but she understood enough. Enough to know that a man named Victor Ashcroft wanted it back badly enough to send people after her. Enough to know that 2 of those people had already found her once, in a boarding house in St. Louis, and that she'd gone out a second-floor window in her nightgown with bare feet and a reticule that held everything she owned. That had been 6 weeks ago. She'd been moving ever since. The stagecoach lurched again, and this time it slowed, the horses dropping from their labored trot to a reluctant walk as the grade steepened. Evelyn could see it now through the ice-clouded window. The road climbing into a narrow cut between 2 ridges, pine dark on both sides, the snow coming heavier here. The light was failing. It was barely past 3 in the afternoon and the light was already pulling back into the trees. She had chosen the Montana Territory because it was the most remote place she could think of. She had chosen Harlan Creek specifically because a women's aid society in Chicago operated a correspondence service that placed women of good character with upstanding men of the frontier who seek respectable companionship. It sounded almost comical when she thought about it now. Women of good character. She hadn't felt like a woman of particularly good character for some time, but she had a forged letter of reference, a borrowed name, and nowhere else to go. The man she was going to marry, if she got there, if he was real, if this wasn't some elaborate trap, was named Ronan Blackwood. She knew almost nothing about him. The brief correspondence they'd exchanged through the aid society had been formal and short. He trapped furs in the mountains above Harlan Creek. He owned land. He was, in the words of the society's representative, not a man of many words, but a man who keeps them. She had read that line several times and tried to decide if it was reassuring. She'd mostly decided it wasn't. The stagecoach came down a long slope and into the valley, and Evelyn got her first look at Harlan Creek. It wasn't much. A main street barely wide enough to deserve the name, with maybe a dozen buildings on either side. A general store, a livery, what looked like a saloon with its shutters nailed against the wind, a smaller building with a painted sign she couldn't read at this distance. Snow on all of it, unbroken on the rooftops, churned to brown mush in the street where horses and boots had been through it. 3 men stood outside the livery watching the stagecoach come in with the particular expressionless attention of people who didn't have anywhere else to be. The whole place looked like it was bracing for something. Evelyn pulled her coat tighter and told herself she was ready for whatever came next. She was getting fairly good at telling herself things that weren't entirely true. The stagecoach came to a stop outside the general store with a grinding of the brake and a final protest from the horses, and the driver, a weathered man named Cleet, who had said approximately 40 words to her since Billings, climbed down and wrenched the door open. Harlan Creek, he said, which was probably the most unnecessary announcement of his career. Evelyn descended the steps carefully. Her legs were stiff from the cold and the hours of sitting and the particular kind of tension that lives in a person's thighs when they've been bracing against every jostle of a bad road. She landed on the packed snow of the street and caught her balance and stood up straight. That was when she saw him. He was standing by the post at the corner of the general store, not quite leaning on it, not quite standing free of it either. Tall. Genuinely tall. The kind of tall that didn't apologize for itself, with wide shoulders and a coat of dark wool that had seen hard use. His hat was pulled low against the cold, and he had a beard. Dark, close trimmed, the kind that accumulated rather than was deliberately grown. He looked like he was maybe 35, maybe 40. He was watching her with dark brown eyes that were steady and gave nothing away. He was holding a piece of paper. She recognized it. It was one of the letters she'd sent through the Aid Society. She could see her own careful handwriting from 10 feet away, and the sight of it in his hand did something strange to her stomach. "Miss Caldwell?" he said. Caldwell. The name she'd given them. She'd forgotten for half a second, and the pause before she answered was a fraction too long. "Yes," she said, "that's me." Something moved in his eyes. Not suspicion, exactly. More like noting. He folded the letter and put it in his coat pocket. "Ronan Blackwood," he said, and extended his hand. She shook it. His hand was very large and very warm and extremely calloused, and she was pathetically grateful for the warmth. "I have a wagon," he said. "Your things?" "One trunk." He nodded and went to get it from the back of the coach without another word. Evelyn stood in the street and watched him lift her trunk. A substantial piece of luggage she'd acquired in St. Louis, packed with winter clothes she'd bought with the last of her savings, and carry it to the wagon bed with the kind of ease that suggested the trunk weighed approximately nothing to him. Cleet the driver was watching too, from beside his horses. He leaned over and said quietly, "You know him?" "He's my husband," Evelyn said. "Or will be." Cleet looked at Blackwood, who was securing the trunk with a rope, then back at her. "He's got a reputation," he said. Evelyn's heart stuttered. What kind of reputation? But Cleet was already climbing back up to his seat, done with his 40 words and apparently unwilling to spend any more. The coach moved off down the street, leaving her standing there. Ronan Blackwood reappeared at her elbow. "Ready?" he said. She looked at him, at his steady eyes, the set of his jaw, the slight turn of his mouth that might have been wariness or might have been nothing at all, and thought, I am traveling into the mountains with a stranger I don't know, and behind me in the direction I came from, men are trying to kill me. "Yes," she said. "Ready." They were married the next morning. The preacher in Harlan Creek was a practical man named Aldous Finch, who officiated in the front room of the general store because the church roof was being patched, and the weather made it impractical. He had a cold and kept pausing the ceremony to blow